check of I've got out here. How many stamps to put on? I've even got one with my name in it, what sounds that? Matthew 121. I think I've ever had a book bubble wrap before. See why it falls a bit. There he is, the Al Governor. Yeah, I'll read the blurb out. A letter from Grosvenor Square. As American ambassador in London, Mr. Winans shared the competence on the one hand of President Roosevelt and on the other of Mr. Churchill and the Allied leaders. Looking in retrospect through the window in Grosvenor, Grosvenor Square, this great American and stalwart friend of Britain traces the story from the day in 1941 when he received a telephone call asking him to see Mr. Roosevelt in Washington, to the dramatic night when, with the news of Pearl Harbor, he became the ambassador of a fully allied instead of a benevolently neutral nation. A record of intense interest to those concerned with Anglo-American relations. This is Britain's war history seen from the outside through the eyes of an onlooker, from the inside through the eyes of a diplomat. It shows some of the most critical events of these years in a new light and presents at close quarters the leading characters in the London political and diplomatic scene. From the first, Mr. Winans made the formal visits incumbent upon a new ambassador, an occasion to get acquainted with his colleagues. The friendly way in which he writes is an integral part of an attractive personality. Dear Jeff, what was this? Flat number 33, Grosvenor Square, London. Dear Jeff, today I am giving up my apartment in the Embassy building, and before leaving I wanted to take a last look at the rooms that were my lodgings for what seemed a very long time. The late afternoon sun is casting a warm and friendly light through the windows. A gentle breeze is stirring and washed worn curtains. The polished furniture, the scrubbed and waxed floor, give impersonal newness to the premises. The familiar objects of home and living are gone. To an outsider, it would seem only a routine affair, a London flat being returned to its owners. But perhaps unusual here because, after 5 years of war, the inventory shows no damage except wear and tear, beyond a bit of shrapnel shattered glass in one of the bedrooms. And yet, somehow, the simple act of closing the door for the last time grips my heart, for it means an ending of so much that has crowded life in the war years. The flat has been my workshop and my living quarters. There are few men in British public life, whether in the government or the armed forces, who have not stopped in at some time, and none in our high command, nor on special missions from the United States, who has not made his way here, and many in the services have found here a night's lodging. It is a practical kind of place with certain security advantages. It juts out from the main building with 3 outside walls, with the embassy officers underneath and trusted people on the floor above. Here we prepared and received night messages. It was equipped with protected telephones, and from here we established a messenger service with Army and Navy signals, and with the embassy code room. The job called for 24-hour duty, and although we arranged shifts from embassy personnel, everybody worked overtime. In less than 3 minutes, I could walk from the flat to my office in the embassy. I never left either place in all those years without stating where I was going and how I could be instantly reached. It was because of the practical advantages of the flat that I decided not to live in the ambassador's official residence, which is a considerable distance away. It was here that Constance joined me shortly after my arrival. It was here that General Ike called us to say that our boy John was missing on a fortress raid, and where later I learned he was a prisoner of war and held as a hostage. It was here that Tommy Hitchcock and I worked on the plans for the long-distance fighter plane, the P-51. And here that I was notified that he had been killed on an experimental flight. These were personal things, but they meant much to me, and I know you will understand because you went to school with Tommy and John is your godson, how this is dedicated to a guy called Jeff Smith. I loaned the flat to Mrs. Roosevelt when she made her visit to pay tribute to the women of Britain. It was after returning here late one night from the Foreign Office that I received a message from Washington announcing the death of President Roosevelt. It was here that I heard of the surrender of the German armies, of Churchill's defeat at the general election, and finally the surrender of Japan. These things that furnish and make a room, more than tables and chairs, well, all that is over now, and I am moving to a small house down the street. One of the deeper reasons for wanting to write to you is the growing disillusionment of today, which not only dims and obscures the present, but is trying to cloud the past. It has seemed to me that many people do not understand the urgency of those days, nor do I think it is sufficiently appreciated how much the British gave us in return for what we gave them, not only in loyalty and friendship, but in practical contributions. You could not live in London in those early years and not realise how narrow was the margin of survival. It would have taken so few mistakes to bring about defeat. The miracle was how few were made and how unimportant in retrospect they were, although in war none is ever without importance, since all decisions touch life and death. Constantly I was reminded of the old-fashioned hourglass that was part of every kitchen in my childhood. When it was first turned for timing, the grain seemed to move slowly from the full upper bowl, but as the sands sank through the narrow vortex, and the grains in the upper bowl lessened, how rapid was the descent. There were many times in the early years of the war when you felt the sands would run out and all would be over. If I say there were many times, at least 4 specific moments in 1940 and 1941 are fixed in my mind, when destiny was to turn the hourglass, when only a few grains were left. In chronological order, these four events were the Battle of Britain, Lend-Lease, the German attack on Russia, and the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The invasion of Russia and the attack of the United States were the great strategic blunders of the Axis powers. These decisions ignored the progress of science and the inexorable logic of the multiplication table. One other factor came later that has recast the future for all men: the invention and use of the atomic bomb. But the shadow of it was always there. The initial research on it was given to us by the British. The interchange of information began in the fall of 1941, and in the summer of 1942 we accepted the obligations of further development and manufacture. The British facilities were already overburdened. If we had not gone to war ourselves, it is very doubtful if we would have been willing to appropriate the huge sums of money and to allocate the necessary industrial facilities to produce this revolutionary weapon. We know that the Germans had begun research in this field before the war, and although they were well behind us when Allied victory came, it is only sense to realise that they would have organised this development if time had been on their side. But, as Mr. Churchill wrote in his statement on atomic energy after the destruction of Hiroshima, by God's mercy, British and American science outpaced all German efforts. The possession of this power by the Germans at any time might have altered the result of the war, and he added, profound anxiety was felt by those who were informed. They were well ahead of us, as it was, in developing radio-controlled rocket projectiles. If we had allowed other nations to go down before the invader, one by one until we ourselves stood alone, we would have faced a militarised world organised against us. Can we believe, as we look back, that had we remained neutral, we would have been sufficiently prepared in offence and defence to have sustained war under atomic attack in such a world? It is true that there were many honest men at home who thought we were more effective in contributing the tools of war as neutrals than we would have been as belligerents. Yet when war came, after mobilising 12 million able-bodied men into the services, we tripled our production. Our slowness before we entered the war to take advantage of the war uses of radar in planes and submarines, and to use the equipment the British offered us to protect our coastal shipping, and our failure to use our own installation at Pearl Harbor successfully are added reasons for believing that all aid short of war was no guarantee of security. In the same period, Great Britain held the line alone. It was always possible that Japan would strike at Britain in the east. Faced at home with the threat of invasion, the British could not have found the forces to stop or even seriously delay an advance, which in default of armed American intervention might well have continued to the Persian Gulf. What effect such an advantage might have had on German strategy and American policy in 1940 to 41 is a matter of conjecture, but the picture of Germany joining hands with Japan on the shores of the Indian Ocean, advancing through Spain and Gibraltar to Dakar, closing the Mediterranean, cutting off the Middle East oil, and severing Britain's lifeline to India and Australia before the end of 1941 would not have been a pleasant one for us or for Russia. It is because of these considerations that the 15 months before we were precipitated into the war were perhaps the most critical of all. After the Battle of Britain, the immediate threat of invasion passed. With the enactment of Lend-Lease, essential supplies were assured for those who remained on the battlefield against the Axis. The German attack on the Russia massed land divisions to meet mass land divisions of the invader. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor made clear the combined purpose of the Axis powers towards the United States. Not so many years ago we were rightly told that this was a time for greatness. When I first read that phrase, it made me think back to the days of Lincoln and of Lee. and I tried to sort out what really counted in the crisis that beset our own country when we were divided against ourselves. That too was a time for decision and a sense of values, and called for sacrifice by the generous and the brave. I was sure if we could find the answer in our own past and in terms that were accepted by the people of the United States, the weight of the New World